John Jacob Astor died in 1848 as America's first multimillionaire, leaving behind $20 million, equivalent to roughly $600 million today. But his greatest fortune wasn't money. It was land. Specifically, a massive estate in Hell Gate, a treacherous stretch of New York's East River where ships routinely sank and currents killed dozens each year. The property should have become America's grandest dynasty seat. Instead, it became a symbol of how quickly vast fortunes can vanish, how ambition can poison generations, and how a curse, whether real or imagined, can destroy everything wealth was supposed to protect. By 1945, nothing remained. Not the mansion, not the fortune, not even the land itself. What happened between Astor's death and the estate's complete erasure is a story of hubris, madness, and the brutal mathematics of inherited wealth meeting inherited dysfunction. John Jacob Astor arrived in America in 1784 with 7 flutes and $25 sewn into his coat. Born in Waldorf, Germany, the son of a butcher, he spoke almost no English and possessed exactly one marketable skill. He could identify quality furs by touch alone. In the freezing markets of Montreal and upstate New York, while other traders haggled over beaver pelts with their eyes, Astor ran his fingers across the fur, feeling for density, texture, and the subtle characteristics that separated premium stock from garbage. This tactile genius made him indispensable to larger trading houses. Within 3 years, he had saved $2,000. By 1800, he controlled the dominant share of the American fur trade, employing networks of trappers from the Great Lakes to the Pacific Northwest. His method was simple and brutal. He extended credit to trappers at exorbitant rates, accepted furs as payment, then sold those furs to Europe and China for triple what he'd advanced. Trappers stayed perpetually indebted. Astor grew rich. By 1810, his net worth exceeded $250,000. He was 37 years old and just beginning. The fur trade had taught him the essential principle that would define his fortune: control the resource, control the debt, control the men. When he looked at Manhattan, he saw the same dynamic playing out in real estate. The island was growing, but it was growing chaotically. Most wealthy men bought developed properties in established neighborhoods. Astor bought swamps, rocky outcrops, and land everyone said was worthless. He'd hold it for decades, waiting for the city to expand toward his holdings, then sell at astronomical profit or lease at rates that made him 15% annually in perpetuity. By 1820, he owned significant chunks of what would become the Upper West Side, Midtown, and the East Village. In 1835, at age 72, he made his final and strangest purchase: a wild, rocky peninsula jutting into Hell Gate, where the East River narrowed and created currents so violent they'd claimed over 1,000 lives in the past century. The seller practically begged him to take it for $30,000. Astor paid $20,000 and considered himself generous. He called it his country estate, though it was only 5 miles from City Hall. His plan was simple: build a mansion befitting America's richest man, establish the Astor family as landed gentry, and create a dynasty that would outlast the Vanderbilts, Carnegies, and Rockefellers who hadn't even been born yet. He died 13 years later, never having built a single structure on the property. The problem with the Hell Gate estate wasn't geographical, it was mathematical. By 1848, John Jacob Astor's fortune had grown to $20 million, making him wealthier than the U.S. Treasury. But his will divided this fortune among dozens of relatives, charitable causes, and stipulations. His eldest son, William Backhouse Astor, inherited roughly half the estate, including the Hell Gate property. The rest fragmented across a sprawling family tree. This created an immediate crisis of identity. The Astors were now rich, but they weren't aristocrats. They weren't even particularly respected. Caroline Schermerhorn, who married William Backhouse Astor Jr., in 1853, found herself snubbed by older New York families who considered the Astors nouveau riche fur traders with German accents. The Hell Gate property became symbolically important. It would be the Astor ancestral seat, the American equivalent of an English country house, the physical proof that the family had arrived. But Hell Gate itself resisted civilization. The currents made construction treacherous. Materials had to be barged in during narrow windows of calm water. Workers routinely quit after seeing ships splinter against the rocks. Blasting was required to level building sites. Engineers declared the soil composition unstable. William Backhouse Astor commissioned 3 separate architectural plans between 1850 and 1860, each more ambitious than the last. None broke ground. The problem wasn't money. It was will. William was a cautious man who'd inherited vast wealth, but none of his father's ruthless drive. He preferred managing existing properties to creating new ones. The Hellgate land sat empty, while the Astors built townhouses in Manhattan instead. But the property carried another burden. The locals called it cursed. Hellgate's history was soaked in death. Native tribes had considered it spiritually dangerous. Dutch settlers recorded strange lights over the water. By the 1850s, newspapers routinely published casualty counts from Hellgate shipwrecks. The number climbed past 1,200 by 1860. People drowned within sight of the Astor property. Bodies washed up on Astor beaches. The family tried to ignore the superstition, but servants wouldn't work there after dark. Contractors demanded hazard pay. The curse talk intensified. Then came John Jacob Astor III, born in 1822, who took control of the Hellgate property in 1875 after his father's death. He was nothing like his grandfather. Where the first John Jacob had been coarse, illiterate and shrewd, the third was refined, overeducated and paralyzed by possibility. He'd studied at Columbia and Harvard, spoke 4 languages fluently, collected rare books, and approached the Hellgate problem as an intellectual puzzle rather than a practical challenge. He hired landscape architect Frederick Law Olmsted in 1876 to survey the property and propose solutions. Olmsted, fresh from completing Central Park and deeply interested in how landscape could shape social outcomes, spent 3 months walking the Hellgate grounds. His report, delivered in January 1877, was blunt. The property was magnificent, but fundamentally hostile to human habitation. The rock formations created acoustic anomalies where sounds carried strangely. The currents generated constant wind that made outdoor spaces uncomfortable 8 months of the year. The views were spectacular, but also psychologically oppressive, dominated by the violent water that had killed so many. Olmsted recommended either selling the land or accepting its wildness and building something minimal and modern that worked with the landscape rather than against it. John Jacob Astor III ignored this advice completely. He wanted grandeur, he wanted European formality, he wanted a mansion that announced Astor arrival in unmistakable terms. Between 1878 and 1882, he assembled a team, architect Richard Morris Hunt, who'd studied at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris and designed mansions for the Vanderbilts, landscape architect Jacob Weidenmann, who favored German-style formal gardens, and engineer Theodore Cooper, who'd built railroad bridges across the Mississippi and promised he could tame Hellgate's treacherous shoreline. The 3 men hated each other immediately. Hunt wanted Gothic revival drama. Weidenmann insisted on Italianate terraces. Cooper cared only about engineering feasibility and told both of them their plans were idiotic. The compromise satisfied no one but moved forward anyway. Construction began in June 1882 with a workforce of 140 men. The first challenge was stabilizing the shore. Cooper's solution involved driving iron pilings 40 feet into bedrock, then building a seawall that could withstand Hellgate's currents. This took 8 months and cost $180,000 alone. Materials arrived by barge during brief calm periods, often only 2 hours per day. One shipment of Italian marble sank completely when a sudden current shift caught the delivery boat broadside. 3 workers drowned retrieving it. The main house rose slowly over 4 years. Hunt designed a 48-room Gothic revival mansion with towers that reached 85 feet and commanded views of Hellgate in all directions. The facade featured limestone imported from Caen, France, the same quarries that supplied medieval cathedrals. Inside, the grand hall stretched 60 feet long, with a vaulted ceiling 30 feet high. Hunt commissioned custom woodwork from Austrian craftsmen, oak paneling carved with Astor family crests invented for the occasion, since the Astors had no actual heraldry. The library held 12,000 volumes in floor-to-ceiling mahogany cases. The dining room seated 40 beneath baccarat chandeliers that required a full-time employee to maintain. Every bedroom had ensuite marble bathrooms with hot running water, revolutionary for 1886. The heating system alone cost $45,000 and involved a basement coal furnace complex that consumed 3 tons daily in winter. Weidenmann's gardens terraformed 30 acres with 50,000 cubic yards of imported topsoil, since Hellgate's natural soil couldn't support the English lawns and French parterres Astor demanded. Formal gardens included a maze, a conservatory with tropical plants maintained at 75 degrees year-round, and walking paths lined with sculptures purchased from estate sales of European nobility. Total cost by completion in 1886, $2.3 million, roughly $70 million in today's terms. John Jacob Astor III moved in that November with his wife Charlotte and their son William Waldorf Astor. He was 64 years old and had spent 11 years building his dream. He would live in it for less than 4. The house was magnificent and immediately miserable. The acoustic anomalies Olmsted had warned about made conversation strange. Voices echoed oddly in certain rooms and vanished completely in others. The wind never stopped. Even with all windows closed, drafts moved through the halls, making candles flicker and creating the constant sense of invisible movement. Servants refused to work alone in the towers. Several quit within months, citing unexplained sounds and feelings of dread. Charlotte Astor began experiencing severe headaches within weeks of moving in. By spring 1887, she rarely left her bedroom. Doctors diagnosed neurasthenia, a fashionable 19th century condition that meant no one knew what was wrong. She insisted the house was making her sick. John Jacob III dismissed this as female hysteria, though he himself slept poorly and developed a nervous condition that made his hands shake. His son William Waldorf Astor, then 38, visited rarely and departed quickly, preferring the family's Manhattan townhouse. The Hellgate mansion hosted exactly 3 major social events during the Astor residence. A housewarming in December 1886, attended by 200 guests who praised the architecture and privately called it gloomy. A 4th of July celebration in 1887 that ended early when weather turned violent, and several guests' boats nearly capsized departing, and a Christmas dinner in 1889 that Charlotte insisted on despite being seriously ill, perhaps knowing it would be her last. She died 3 weeks later, aged 63. John Jacob Astor III died 9 months after that in February 1890 at his Manhattan townhouse, not at Hellgate. The official cause was heart failure. His personal physician noted he'd seemed pursued by shadows in his final months. The Hellgate property, that monument to Astor ambition, had been lived in for barely 3 years by the man who built it. But the real curse was just beginning. When William Waldorf Astor inherited Hellgate in 1890, he was already the richest man in America, controlling an estimated $100 million fortune. He was also deeply misanthropic, paranoid, and convinced that American democracy was vulgar and doomed. Within months of his father's death, he made a stunning decision. He abandoned America entirely. In 1891, he moved permanently to England, eventually becoming a British citizen and buying Hever Castle in Kent. He never returned to Hellgate. The mansion sat empty. A skeleton crew of 12 servants maintained it, but no one lived there. Furniture remained under cloth. Gardens went partially wild. The building itself began suffering from the one thing great houses cannot survive: neglect. Without constant heating, moisture invaded the walls. Without regular use, mechanical systems failed. The house wasn't dying, it was entering a coma. Meanwhile, across New York, a massacre of mansions had begun. The federal income tax, enacted in 1913, changed everything. Property taxes in New York quintupled between 1910 and 1920. The cost of maintaining a 40-room mansion ran $150,000 annually by 1920, and the staff required, 30 to 50 people, became impossible to find as servants moved to factory jobs with better pay and Sundays off. Between 1920 and 1950, New York City lost over 300 mansions to demolition. The Vanderbilt Triple Palace on Fifth Avenue, 130 rooms, completed in 1882, demolished in 1926 after standing just 44 years. The William K. Vanderbilt Mansion, finished in 1883, demolished in 1927. The Cornelius Vanderbilt II Mansion, the largest private home ever built in New York at 130 rooms, demolished in 1927. Or the A.T. Stewart Mansion, the Senator Clark Mansion, the Schwab Mansion, gone, razed, replaced by apartment buildings where a single grand house once stood. The mathematics were brutal. A Fifth Avenue mansion sat on land worth $3 million by 1925. As a residence, it generated zero income while costing $200,000 yearly to maintain. As an apartment building, that same land could generate $500,000 annually in rents. The decision made itself. Only an idiot would keep the mansion. But Hellgate wasn't on Fifth Avenue. It was on a rocky peninsula that no one wanted for anything. The Astor family itself had splintered into warring branches by 1920. William Waldorf's son, Waldorf Astor, stayed in England and became a member of Parliament. The American branch, descended from John Jacob III's brother, controlled different properties and had different priorities. No one particularly wanted Hellgate, but no one wanted to sell it either, because doing so would mean admitting defeat, acknowledging the curse, accepting that this monument to Astor ambition had failed completely. So it sat. Through World War I, empty. Through the 1920s, boom, empty. Through the Great Depression, while families lived in Hoovervilles, Hellgate Mansion stood vacant with 48 bedrooms and baccarat chandeliers. The property taxes alone ran $40,000 annually. The maintenance crew dropped to 4, then 2, then 1 elderly caretaker who lived in the carriage house and hadn't been paid in 3 months when he died in 1938. After that, no one even pretended to maintain it. Windows broke and weren't replaced. Weather invaded. The roof began failing in sections. By 1940, the mansion was genuinely dangerous. Floors sagged, ceilings collapsed in the east wing. The heating system had been stripped for scrap metal in 1936 by thieves who'd broken in assuming the house was abandoned, which it essentially was. The Astor family lawyers discussed the property periodically, but reached no consensus. Selling it would realize perhaps $200,000, a pittance against the family's total holdings. Demolishing it would cost $80,000 with no return. The option they chose was worse, nothing. Then came December 7, 1941, and everything changed. Pearl Harbor triggered immediate panic about East Coast vulnerability. Hellgate, with its commanding views and deep water access, suddenly had military value. The Navy approached the Astor estate in January 1942 about leasing the property for a patrol station. The negotiations revealed how completely the property had been neglected. Navy surveyors found the mansion structurally unsound beyond repair. Their report, filed March 1942, recommended immediate demolition as a safety hazard. The Astor lawyers saw an escape. They donated the property to the Navy in April 1942, taking a charitable tax deduction of $300,000 based on optimistic land valuation. The Navy accepted, then immediately contracted demolition. Between May and August 1942, workers systematically destroyed what had taken 4 years to build. Salvageable materials, marble, woodwork, fixtures were sold to reclamation yards. Everything else was smashed and hauled away. By September 1942, 56 years after completion, the Hellgate Mansion had been erased completely. The Navy built temporary wooden structures for their patrol station. These operated until 1945, were abandoned after the war, and burned in a mysterious fire in 1947. Today, the land is part of a public park. Nothing remains of the Astor estate except some foundation stones visible at low tide and a historical marker that gets the dates wrong. What destroyed Hellgate wasn't the curse, though locals never stopped believing in one. It was the collision of 3 forces: inherited wealth without inherited purpose, changing economics that made grand estates impossible to maintain, and a family structure that distributed responsibility so widely that no one felt truly accountable. When William Waldorf Astor abandoned Hellgate in 1891, He made a choice that seemed rational. He had other, better properties and no emotional attachment to a house that had killed his grandmother and driven his grandfather to an early grave. But by abandoning it rather than selling it, he trapped the property in limbo. It became an asset no one wanted and no one would relinquish. The estate's destruction unfolded across 6 decades in slow motion, 11 years to build, 3 years of miserable habitation, 52 years of decay. Each phase revealed a different failure. The construction phase showed how wealth could override sense, building grandeur where Olmsted explicitly warned against it. The habitation phase proved that architectural magnificence cannot overcome environmental hostility. The house was beautiful and genuinely unpleasant to live in. The decay phase demonstrated the iron mathematics of maintenance. Without constant investment, grand houses die, and maintaining them requires either occupation or irrational devotion to preservation. The Astors had neither. They were too rich to care about Hellgate and too proud to sell it. By contrast, examine the few great estates that survived. Biltmore Estate in North Carolina, completed 1895 for George Washington Vanderbilt, survived because his daughter Cornelia and her husband John Cecil made the radical decision in 1930 to open it to the public, charging admission and transforming it from a private mansion into a paying attraction. This was considered vulgar at the time. It saved the estate. The Breakers in Newport, completed 1895 for Cornelius Vanderbilt II, survived because his daughter Countess Gladys Sechenyi donated it to the Preservation Society of Newport County in 1948, accepting that private ownership was impossible. Lyndhurst in Tarrytown, completed 1841, survived because its final owner, Anna Gould, established preservation provisions before her death in 1961. Each survivor shared the same insight. Grand estates required new economic models to survive. They needed to generate income, whether through tourism, educational use, or charitable designation. Private ownership in the old aristocratic model was finished. The families that adapted survived. Those that clung to old forms lost everything. Hellgate had no such salvation because it had no champion. When destruction came in 1942, no Astor objected, no family member mourned. There was no dramatic last stand, no desperate attempt to save the mansion. The lawyers signed papers. The demolition crews arrived, that was all. In this sense, Hellgate's story isn't tragic, it's inevitable. The tragedy lies in the waste. John Jacob Astor III spent $2.3 million building a monument to family permanence. Adjusted for inflation, that's roughly $70 million in today's currency. This fortune created exactly 3 years of miserable habitation, then 52 years of decay, then complete erasure. The return on investment was catastrophically negative. But the deeper waste was human. 3 generations of Astors were in different ways destroyed by Hellgate. John Jacob III exhausted himself building it and died believing he'd failed to establish the dynasty seat his father's fortune deserved. Charlotte Astor's health collapsed in the house, and she died convinced it was poisoned. William Waldorf Astor's abandonment of the property symbolized his larger abandonment of America and his family's legacy, leading to dynastic fracture that never healed. The mansion's 50-year decay paralleled the Astor family's slow dissolution from unified dynasty to scattered feuding branches. By 1950, there was no single Astor fortune anymore. There were dozens of minor fortunes distributed across heirs who shared little but a name. The concentration of wealth and purpose that made John Jacob Astor powerful had been diffused to meaninglessness. Hellgate was both symbol and cause of this dissolution. It represented dynastic ambition while demonstrating dynastic failure. And the curse. Maybe it was real, not supernatural but mathematical. The curse was this: wealth without purpose decays at a fixed rate, and grand houses accelerate that decay by demanding constant attention and investment. Hellgate sat on treacherous land where over 1,200 people had died. Building there was hubristic, living there was unpleasant, maintaining it while uninhabited was economically irrational. Every decision regarding Hellgate was defensible individually but collectively catastrophic. That's not supernatural. That's the curse of inherited wealth meeting poor judgment across 3 generations. The property's complete erasure by 1945 meant that America's first billionaire family's grandest architectural ambition left literally nothing behind except a cautionary tale. Today, if you visit the former Hellgate estate, now part of Ralph DeMarco Park in Queens, you can stand where the mansion's grand entrance once stood. The view is still spectacular. Hellgate's currents remain treacherous, though modern engineering tamed them somewhat in 1885, when the Army Corps of Engineers blasted flood rock, the worst navigational hazard. The water is still violent, the wind still never stops, and if you know where to look, at low tide you can see foundation stones, huge granite blocks cut to support 85-foot towers. They sit half-buried in mud, worn smooth by decades of tidal action, leading nowhere, supporting nothing. These stones, imported from quarries in Massachusetts, hauled by barge through treacherous currents, placed with precision by skilled masons, were built to last 1,000 years. They'll probably achieve that. The house they supported lasted 56. That's the final irony. The materials were eternal, the vision was generational, but the will to maintain, to inhabit, to care, dissolved in a single lifetime. John Jacob Astor: I built a fortune from nothing through relentless focus and brutal pragmatism. His grandson spent a fraction of that fortune building a dream house no one wanted to live in. His great-grandson abandoned it without looking back. 3 generations from focus to fantasy to abandonment, Hellgate wasn't cursed by spirits. It was cursed by a family that mistook building monuments for building legacy, that confused architectural grandeur with dynastic permanence, that learned too late that houses need more than money to survive. They need purpose. They need people who care. They need reasons beyond ego and ambition. Hellgate had none of these. So it died slowly, expensively, inevitably, teaching future generations a lesson they mostly haven't learned, that building is easy, maintaining is hard, and the difference between the two is everything. The stones remain, testimony to ambition. The absence of everything else testifies to the rest.